6 weeks after I buried my husband, I was standing in the lobby of a small coastal hotel in Savannah, Georgia, waiting for my sister Nadia to finish checking us in. When I saw a man across the courtyard who made the entire world seem to stop. He was older than the photographs I remembered, thinner around the face and wearing a faded green jacket, but when he turned his head and rubbed the back of his neck, the same nervous habit he had whenever he was hiding something, I knew with terrifying certainty that the stranger was Ethan, the husband whose death certificate was sitting inside a folder in my bedroom back home. I had watched a closed casket lowered into the ground after what everyone called a tragic highway accident in North Carolina. I had listened to his coworkers describe his final hours, and I had spent 43 days learning how to wake up in a house where his shoes were still beside the door. So when Nadia whispered, "Don't move, Mara," I could barely breathe before answering, "That's him." And she quietly replied, "I know, which is why you need to see what I found before you confront him." 2 days earlier, Nadia had arrived at my apartment before sunrise carrying a paper bag filled with coffee, a folder of bank statements, and the expression of someone who had discovered a secret too dangerous to explain over the phone. And after refusing to tell me anything until we were on the road, she finally admitted that she had noticed a series of payments leaving an account Ethan and I shared even after his supposed death, including a monthly transfer to a private storage company in Savannah and a much larger payment made 3 days before the accident that had never appeared on our household records. "I thought grief was making you miss something," she told me as rain streaked the windshield. "But then I found a photograph taken after Ethan died. And when she handed me her phone, I saw a security camera image of my husband entering a marina under another name, carrying a black duffel bag and looking directly at the camera as if he knew someday someone would come searching for him. Beneath the photograph were records showing that someone had been renting a furnished cottage for nearly a year, purchasing prepaid phones and withdrawing cash from an account connected to a company called Harbor Meridian. And the strangest part was that the person listed as the emergency contact wasn't a lover or an old friend. It was my late father's former business partner, a man named Victor Hale, whom Ethan had supposedly never trusted. I wanted to believe there had been some mistake, but Nadia had already contacted a retired financial investigator named Leonard Price, and his preliminary findings turned my grief into something colder because Ethan hadn't simply disappeared. He had spent 14 months quietly dismantling our financial life while creating a second identity, moving money through small consulting contracts, transferring ownership of equipment, and taking out a $96,000 loan against the townhouse I thought we owned outright. I confronted Nadia about why she had waited before telling me. She admitted she had been afraid that confronting Ethan too early would make him vanish permanently. But before I could answer, the man across the courtyard stood up, walked toward a woman sitting beneath an umbrella, and placed his hand on her shoulder. The woman was not his mother, not Victor, and not anyone I recognized, yet she handed him a folder and said something that made him suddenly look toward the hotel entrance. And at that exact moment, Nadia grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Mara, if he sees you, we may never learn why he did this." But I was already staring at the woman because she had just turned around, and I recognized her face from an old photograph hidden inside Ethan's desk. A woman named Celeste Ward, whom he had once told me had died years ago. We didn't confront Ethan that afternoon, and instead Nadia followed the woman after she left the courtyard while I stayed behind with Leonard on the phone, trying to understand how a dead man could have maintained a financial network for more than a year without anyone noticing. By evening, Celeste contacted me herself and asked to meet at a quiet bookstore on the edge of the city, where she confessed that Ethan had never planned to fake his death for another woman, but had become trapped inside a scheme he originally created to escape debts, lawsuits, and a business partner who threatened to expose him for stealing millions from a construction company. "He told me you would be protected," Celeste said, tears gathering in her eyes, "and I believed him because he convinced me that you knew more than you actually did." But then she revealed the detail that changed everything. Ethan's fatal accident had been but he had deliberately used another man's identification documents and abandoned the scene afterward, allowing investigators to believe the unidentified victim was him while he disappeared with the intention of returning months later once his creditors stopped looking. I felt sick when I realized that an innocent man's family had been grieving while I mourned a husband who was alive. And when Celeste placed a small metal key on the table, she said, "This opens the only thing Ethan was afraid you would find." And suddenly the mystery wasn't about why my husband had survived. It was about what he had hidden from all of us. The key led us to a rented locker outside Charleston, where Leonard found boxes filled with contracts, encrypted drives, handwritten notes, and photographs documenting Ethan's secret financial dealings. But buried beneath those papers was something far more personal. Letters Ethan had written to me during the final months of our marriage. Letters he had never sent because each one described his fear that I would discover how deeply he had betrayed me. One letter began with the words, "Mara, if you ever find this, it means the plan failed," and as I read through pages describing forged signatures, hidden accounts, and his intention to make me appear responsible for certain debts. I realized he hadn't disappeared because he wanted a new life. He had disappeared because he wanted me to become the person who carried the consequences of the old one. Nadia sat beside me in the dusty storage room and asked, "Do you want me to stop?" And I shook my head because for the first time my tears weren't coming from grief but from clarity. Until Leonard suddenly opened the final box and discovered a second set of documents showing that Victor Hale had secretly been feeding Ethan false information for months, intending to let Ethan take the blame for a much larger fraud while Victor escaped overseas. We decided not to warn Ethan that we knew and instead allowed him to believe his carefully constructed disappearance was still working while Leonard coordinated with investigators and Celeste provided evidence of her own involvement. 3 nights later, Ethan returned to the townhouse expecting to find the frightened widow he thought he had manipulated. But instead, he walked into a living room where Nadia was sitting beside Leonard. Victor's former attorney was waiting near the window, and I was standing beside the dining table holding the letter he had written but never intended me to read. "You should have stayed dead," I told him quietly, and his face collapsed as he realized that every escape route had disappeared. But rather than begging for forgiveness, Ethan immediately blamed Victor, then Celeste, then even me, claiming that he had only lied because he was trying to protect our marriage from problems I supposedly couldn't understand. I listened until he finished, then placed the letter on the table and said, "You didn't lose your life because everyone betrayed you, Ethan. You lost it because you kept turning people into tools and calling it protection." And when investigators entered moments later, he finally understood that the woman he expected to manipulate had become the one person he could no longer control. Months later, Ethan faced the consequences of the fraud and identity deception. Victor was investigated for his role in the larger financial scheme, and Celeste cooperated with authorities while accepting responsibility for the choices she had knowingly made. But my own victory wasn't seeing Ethan arrested or watching his carefully planned future collapse. It was waking up one morning in a small house near the water, realizing I had finally stopped measuring my life by what he had taken from me. I sold the townhouse, closed every account connected to him, kept only the photographs that represented memories I genuinely valued, and changed my emergency contact to Nadia, because I had learned that sometimes the hardest part of surviving betrayal isn't discovering that someone lied to you, but accepting that the person you loved may never have been the person you believed them to be. When I think about that afternoon in Savannah now, I remember the man across the courtyard, the shock of recognizing him, and the moment I understood that I hadn't been given a second chance to save my marriage. I had been given a second chance to save myself. And if this story reminded you that truth can arrive long after heartbreak, please remember that rebuilding your life doesn't require erasing the past, only refusing to let someone else's lies decide your future. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.